Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of What's Next. This is part of the innovation series, and we have a really special guest today. We have Vikram Ahuja. He's a serial entrepreneur and he has built multiple businesses. He has led startups in the e-commerce, travel, and founded one of India's earliest startup accelerators called Kyron. I'm sure people would have heard about them. Got acquired by Techstars also a few years back. He currently runs something really interesting called Talent 500. Talent 500 kind of works with some of the world's leading organizations and GCCs, and basically they help in helping them build high impact global teams right here in India. Vikram, welcome. Pleasure to have you.
Thanks so much, Vishal. Thanks for having me on today.
Great. So Vikram, just wanted to check with you, get an overview of, since you have been in the GCC space with Answer Consulting as well, just wanted to get from you of the landscape. How does the GCC landscape look like in India? Just a few thoughts that would be great to start with.
Sure. So Vishal, just as a quick introduction, I run Talent 500, and what we do is work with some of the world's leading businesses to help them set up, manage, and run their global capability centers, or GCCs. The whole notion of building a global workforce, of course, is extremely timely today. We live in a world where, suddenly all of us with COVID became remote workers overnight, and the acceptability and openness for building and adopting a distributed workforce has never been as high as it is today. So where we are today within the GCC sector is that it's probably at its peak, both in terms of maturity as well as in terms of some of the growth. Just some quick stats, perhaps, that might help put this into context. Out of India's roughly 4.5 million engineers, about 1.3 million engineers work for GCCs or work for global companies that have centers in India. Yes, this year, NASSCOM also announced that in GCCs today contribute about 1% of India's GDP. So GCCs are officially now a national agenda, right? And there's three reasons why that's so. One, creates jobs. We've seen today that there's tremendous amounts of influx of companies looking for top talent. So the demand or surge of professionals that are getting employed by these companies continues to grow. But it's not just professionals being employed directly as engineers or technology professionals, but it's everything that the ecosystem creates, right? You're talking about real estate, you're talking about logistics, operations. It's a fairly intense process to run GCCs. And so therefore the employment created as a result is tremendous. The second thing that GCCs are doing today is bringing in investment. So at Answer, over the last 15 years, of course, we've become a market leader in building our GCCs. Today, we have brought in about $1.5 billion worth of foreign direct investment in the technology center, just via GCCs in India. And that's just us, right? I mean, we're about 10% of the market, but you can imagine how much money is being brought into the country by global companies. So therefore, that investment is a huge component of why GCCs are today a big part of the national agenda. The third thing that GCCs are really doing is creating massive impact in terms of the growth of the ecosystem. Today, you have everyone from a Facebook and Twitter all the way to some of the fastest growing young startups in the world that are looking to India for talent. And the whole notion of what a GCC is and the way businesses will be built in the future with a global workforce is changing. And therefore, we have a tremendous opportunity as a country to really be, the hotbed or the headquarters of global talent. And that's essentially what's happening. So, tremendous time to be working in this space. GCCs are growing at about 12 to 15% a year. This was pre-COVID. Of course, those numbers will potentially be back to those ratios soon. But compared to the rest of the technology industry that was growing anywhere between 5 to 7%. So by far, GCCs drive the growth of the Indian technology landscape. And just by virtue of everything that I've mentioned today, it's probably the most exciting part of working in this space today.
Got it, Vikram. Thanks for that. Just for people, listeners who want to know more about GCC, so GCC's full form is Global Capability Centers. Is that right, Vikram? Or is there a...
That is correct, yes. And that's the nomenclature in terms around this have changed quite significantly over the years. So that this is the current avatar, I guess.
Okay, great. Just want to maybe touch upon the history of GCC. I think, say, India started with their outsourcing of IT work back in the 80s, 90s with Infosys, TCS. And I think GCC would have come in the 2000s. So if we can just touch upon how the GCCs have evolved in the past, I don't know, 15, 20 years would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So GCC, it's important to sort of understand that GCCs are not new, right? I mean, so this started really out in the late 80s, and you had Texas Instruments and Motorola that sort of pioneered the concept of setting up a global workforce, largely driven by their need to find talent. Since then, a lot of deep tech, high tech companies like Cisco, companies like Intel, a lot of these companies that were looking to tap into volume or pools of talent started looking at India as being a very viable center for them to build out these R&D centric engineering teams. And then, of course, post that, when you had the services wave, and you had the Infosys and Wipros of the world that were taking talent from India externally, I think what that did is just brought a lot of exposure to some of the more new age digital skills that companies started now saying, if I'm going to be outsourcing to a third party, maybe there's an opportunity for me to build it myself, right? So GCCs have sort of started out from being, if you look at the whole offshoring wave, started out from being called captives to global in-house centers to today, as they're called, global capability centers. And where we are today is there's multiple versions of GCCs that exist. You've got everything from the old school, high commitment, thousands of people working in one center. You've got hybrid models where companies look at setting up GCCs via build, operate, transfer models, where they have someone else do it for them, and then they would eventually take those over. Today, you've also got a case where companies are building out GCCs virtually, and that's a lot of what we do at Talent 500, which is working with companies of all sizes, build and manage a global workforce without necessarily needing sometimes the commitment of setting up a legal entity or having a workspace. I think all of this is, of course, very uniquely possible today, given everything that we've been through over the last year and a half. But, as GCCs continue to mature, I think the other change that's happening and that's relevant in the history of GCCs is just the positioning of a GCC within the broader organizational context. I think when the concept of building a GCC started, it was largely to access talent. Much of this talent was used in support functions or working more to augment existing teams. And that has now today shifted 180 degrees. Today, GCCs represent an extremely critical part of a company's transformation and innovation agenda. So today, if you look at most large enterprises, many of these are, either they lack the access to talent because of where they're located, or they lack the brand to access top talent. And for many of them, this transformation into becoming, technology first, cloud first, mobile first companies is accompanied by a need to tap into talent. And so therefore today, a lot of the core work that is being done to transform some of the world's largest companies is happening out of GCCs. One interesting way to know that that's happening is if you look at the number of global CXOs, CTOs, CIOs that are potentially operating out of places like Bangalore, right? And these are CXOs of multi-billion dollar businesses that are today sitting in Bangalore and, responsible for really running a very important part of the business. This would have never happened before, right? GCCs would have been probably the back end of taking, doing what was decided at HQ. That whole concept of an HQ has shifted tremendously.
Right. Vikram, actually, I second that because I was at one of the GCCs in my previous role, and I've seen that a lot of work coming, a lot of core operations work coming into India and being developed by a 3,000 odd strong team here. And I've heard multiple times the CEO mention the advantages of having a team in India and providing the cloud, as you said, right, mobile first, cloud first technologies from India. So I think looks like that is the future. I think most large enterprises would go that route at some point. So no, I mean, that's pretty good. So having said that, I think India is in a kind of a very enviable position as having the technology capabilities, the talent, at the same time, decent government policy is also favoring it. So if you could just kind of give a quick overview on how can India position itself? Obviously, we're doing well, but how can we be just the go-to market or go-to destination for these large companies?
Yeah, and yeah, that's a great question. And I think if you were to look at what contributes towards developing a sustainable ecosystem or a thriving sort of ecosystem for the growth of GCCs, so largely it's three things. It's talent, of course, at the core of it. It is the broader sort of infrastructure that is provided by regulators and governments. And then the third is, of course, the potential of the enterprise to grow, right? So it all starts out with what is the ecosystem that is being created together by these three pillars. And if you look at what governments do, they play a very important role in terms of setting together the regulatory framework for some of these global companies to operate easily. This is something that I think India has taken the lead on. We've done a great job with creating, special economic zones, creating incentives and rebates for companies of all sizes to operate, and incentivizing them in many different ways to come and set up and invest in India. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is just availability of talent and just continuously refreshing that talent pool so that you have top quality talent available at all times, right? And this is, a bit of an unfair advantage that we have in India, given that we probably have one of the largest community of engineers in the world, right? And that what that means is you've got 4.5 million people who speak English, who are able to work within a global setup. And really sort of if a company is looking to scale, then there's no better place to do that in India. And then the third part of it is, of course, just the broader ecosystem that gets developed, right? Whether that's, things such as your startups that come into play, you've got product companies, you've got activities in the VCPE front. It really sort of makes sure that you've got a thriving ecosystem of talent cycling in and out, which is so core to GCCs. So from where India is today, I think we have an interesting problem on our hands, which is that the demand for talent in India is now coming in from three channels. You've got, of course, GCCs, but the strong local competition is local startups. And then you've got, your sort of local kind of old school services companies or industries and so on. And that demand for challenge is creating a little bit of unpredictability in the market. The cost arbitrage that a lot of GCCs were trying to tap into when they initially started is slowly sort of diluting away. And for many, it's becoming a harder market to navigate than before. In my view, I think this correction was long overdue. I think Indian talent deserved a correction given the quality that we've produced. So it's not something that we should be throwing our hands up and sort of blaming the professional market. Of course, there's a lot to be said about how some of the recruiting processes and just the interface between companies and professionally, that could be done a lot better. But in my view, I think a lot is already being done. Governments continue to put out incredible policies. There are new economic zones and new sort of developments that are coming out. Places such as Gujarat just announced something called the Gift City, which they want to convert into one of the largest fintech hubs for GCCs. And there's a lot of competition, which is great. From a talent perspective, I think things such as flexible work, remote work, etc., is obviously creating a lot more of an appetite amongst people to just work from anywhere. And then it's up to the companies to be able to adapt to that. And then the third part of it is I think we must be aware of what's happening globally. A lot of new hubs are being created. For example, I'm speaking to you from Dubai right now, and there's a lot of work that local governments are doing here to make this region as a hub for technology talent, right? And this isn't in one-off case. You've got places like Lisbon, you've got places like Miami, you've got places like Austin, where essentially a lot of governments and regulators are trying to put a lot of might behind transforming these into big hubs. So as India starts to get competition from other markets, I think we have to remember that at the end of the day, it's about talent and it's about developing that social infrastructure and quality of life that is needed to attract and retain top talent. And I think that's something that is often underlooked, but potentially long term has the biggest impact.
Got it. No, that's an interesting point. I think you had mentioned the astronomical salaries that have come into the Indian market, right? I think the cost arbitrage that you mentioned is no more there, because your Indian local startups and other local companies are kind of offering similar or more in terms of compensation and other facilities. So because of that, I think talent are more keen to work in a growth stage startup. So I'm sure there'll be correction, as you said. But having said that, I think it has overall benefited the startup ecosystem per se. So Vikram, I just wanted to get your thoughts on, since we have over 1,500 companies in India right now. Just wanted to get few thoughts on this. Obviously, talent bit you have already shared, but just want to see how that the GCC market in India is developing the startup ecosystem, and how the startup ecosystem is helping the GCC. So just a few there would be interesting.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think often perhaps one of the biggest benefits that global companies get by setting up a GCC is access to a startup ecosystem, and such close access to in a place like Bangalore, where literally everyone's working side by side.
True.
So again, if you look at the history and many of the objectives for why GCCs are set up, in almost all cases, tapping into innovation, tapping into growth, tapping into transformation and digital technologies is often amongst the top core agendas of any GCC. And a big part of sort of furthering this transformation and innovation is being able to tap into smart, innovative entrepreneurs who are really pushing the boundaries in the same industries that the GCCs operate.
True. Exactly. True.
So I think if you look at most companies, about 2 decades ago, the default reaction was to the way they thought about tackling someone like Amazon was to pretend that it never existed, and unfortunately, it costs a lot of large companies very dearly, right?
True.
Whereas I think today companies are smarter, and there's a proactive and intentional effort to actually engage with startups. So there's a couple of things that GCCs do. Corporate accelerators, for example, have been probably the oldest weapon in the book. We used to run.
True.
I founded a startup accelerator called Chiron back in the day, and we were one of the first companies to set up corporate accelerators. And the idea was to sort of connect the startups and grown-ups, so as to speak. And we had, I think, we were lucky that we were able to sort of tap into the market when it was early, and we had tremendous success just connecting companies that were doing some incredible work, let's say in domains such as fintech or retail, and with larger retail and fintech companies, global companies that were looking to innovate. And so it was just a match made in heaven. So that's one. The second thing that GCCs have been doing more recently, some of them have done, is they've set up sort of venture funds internally where they're investing into startups as well. The idea is to see if they can, rather than competing, collaborate or partner, and do so in a manner that gives them some skin in the game and a seat on the table. The third thing, of course, that a lot of GCCs are doing is just embarking on pilot projects, bringing startups in to actually solve for problems. And we've seen some tremendous success stories there as well. Just, literally startups that are a year and a half old, working with multi-billion-dollar companies and actually
True.
having the sort of impact that they promise. So I think the access there that entrepreneurs have to some of these companies in places such as India is a lot stronger than if these companies were trying to tap into the HQ, wherever that is in North America, because the decision-making structure at a GCC is a lot more agile. It's a lot more nimble. Innovation is top of mind for the leadership. Everybody wants to move quick. And so a lot of startups are able to make a lot more progress. In fact, funnily, when we were running the startup accelerator, we had a lot of US-based startups applying to our Indian accelerators because they could get access to US-based companies out of India, right? So really weird so US company that couldn't even, get through the door of, or even have someone pick up the calls, was suddenly sitting face to face with an engineering leader and pitching this really cool solution and sort of getting it approved, right? So I think innovation is huge, startups are huge, and I think there's definitely a lot of synergies there in those relationships that can be explored.
Awesome, Vikram. I second that because I was also in a corporate accelerator and a large US retailer. So we had startups from all over the world kind of applied to us. And then we said, hey, no, we're looking at Indian startups for now. And then um, we got actually a couple of startups from the US who kind of tried pitching to US stakeholders
Yeah,
there, but
yeah,
they
yeah,
came through us. So yeah, I get that.
yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
Maybe last few thoughts, Vikram, on see, I think we touched upon a lot of things. I think from talent to I think government policy, growth for these large enterprises. That can we do that in India? Obviously, investment is also a part of it, and then at the same time, the benefiting the startup ecosystem, both wise startup ecosystem benefiting and the GCC. Just wanted to maybe get your final thoughts on best practices. This is obviously from a point of view of the GCC. For example, I'm a large enterprise in the US or UK, and looking at India as my okay, I finalized. I'm looking at India as my final destination. What could be the maybe 2 or 3 best practices that a GCC could look at to do to set up quickly and kind of look at a within 6 months to 1 year, set it up in India. So just few thoughts that would be great.
Yeah, no, and Vishal, in many ways, the playbook for success, I guess, for GCCs is a complex one. Uh, and yet I think the impact, of course, is so important that it's important to get it right early. So a couple of things that we focus on, right? We spend a lot of time upfront on really sort of laying down a vision for what the GCC has to accomplish, right? What is the main purpose or objective that it's being set up for? Is it to augment your existing teams? Is it to access skills or talent that you don't have access to today? Is it to tap into an ecosystem that might potentially accelerate some part of your growth? Is it all of them? Is it none of them? I think it's important to be able to articulate what that is, and in doing so, then create a very clear vision for what that employer brand looks like in India or wherever the GCC is being set up. Often we've seen that companies will rush through this decision and try and sell their brand in a GCC talent market the same way as they do in HQ. And often that doesn't fly because there absolutely must be a much clearer communication of why this company is important. Just as an example, many of the successful GCCs in India today are technology companies in one country and retail companies in another. And you look at, for example, Target, or you look at Lowe's, these are fantastic brands in the US and everybody knows them and everybody shops them, but they're not necessarily technology companies or just weren't historically in the past. Whereas in India, they represent some of the most attractive technology companies in the GCC space today, right? And being able to separate out that brand and clearly call out why is this GCC looking to set up, what is the mission, what is the vision, only helps attract the best talent. Which brings me to the second part of the playbook, which is having a very robust, diverse talent strategy. I think today the war for talent has never been as strong as it has ever been, I guess, in history. And so therefore GCCs need to understand that they need to be going in with an extremely realistic view of what the talent landscape looks like, be competitive with market in terms of compensation and benefits, be very vocal about the culture and flexibility that they bring, and must quickly adapt to newer models that the market is offering. So for example, today, remote work and flexible work seems to be definitely in demand, right? And so for a lot of GCCs that may not want to do this permanently, is there a shorter term sort of flexibility that they can provide? As part of diversifying the talent strategy, the other thing that I would also talk about is going in with a very open mind in terms of how that teams need to be built. Typically, hiring full-time employees used to be the only way that you could build a team. Whereas today, we propose more hybrid models, hire full-time, hire contingent workers, hire in places such as India, but also build out a global workforce simultaneously. And the reason for that is, the more you are agile and nimble to react to what the market looks like, the faster you can be successful, right? And therefore being very open to what the needs of the talent market are is crucial. So those two, and then the third part of it, I think, is just finally is in terms of onboarding and integration, which is, how can you replicate the culture that you have at HQ at your GCC? Most large enterprises have extremely well articulated and well-defined cultural practices and rituals, right? They are extremely proud of who they are, where they come from, and how they work. And that translating that into something that the GCC can follow and implement without it necessarily being a forced fit is just an underestimated superpower. I think if you can get culture and integration right, then you have 80% of the game won.
Or Vikram, I think very interesting points. I think pretty clear. I think once objectives are articulated, I think getting your talent strategy, employer branding in that particular country. I think the third bit you're saying on integration and culture. I think obviously in that order, but each one is so important, right? I think each one has to be right. Otherwise, GCC may not fly for the longer time is my view, because I've also been in one. So I've seen that all the three that you mentioned were pretty clear where I was. And because of that, that particular brand has been able to create the mark in India. So thanks for that, Vikram. I think that's interesting. I think this playbook that you just mentioned is for all countries, right, Vikram? Need not be only India, right? Could be for wherever this enterprise wants to
this
set
is
up.
absolutely. And of course, we did mention India a few times. That's because India is the largest sort of market today for GCCs, but it's certainly not the only.
Got it. Great, Vikram. Going, I think, to the last bit of this podcast, is just wanted to check with you on. I just wanted to do a kind of a crystal ball gazing. What could the future of this space look like? And maybe you could give perspectives from the GCC point of view. And since we are talking about India is the GCC land for the largest GCC in the world. A perspective of India as well. Maybe a couple of points from either perspectives, 3 to 5 years kind of horizon.
Yeah, absolutely, Vishal. So I, extremely excited about what the future of work holds, as we like to call it. We live in a world where today opportunity is truly global, right? Companies are building teams where the talent is and not the other way around. And this means that the potential to build distributed workforce, the potential for opportunity or access to opportunity to be truly democratized, and for us to forever change the way work is done is extremely exciting. And of course, GCCs are exactly that, right? They're global hubs or global workforces that are redefining companies. So in terms of the future, I think a couple of things that we are seeing already. I think the concept of a GCC itself will change. There will be multiple models available for companies to set up and run a GCC. And I mentioned some of them earlier. Some of them could be co-located, so having teams in one location. You could have remote GCCs with people sitting in different places. You could have hybrid models and so on. The second thing is just the makeup of talent itself. We spoke about full-time versus contingent versus hybrid models. So we expect a lot more of flexibility that companies will show in terms of how these models operate and play with each other. And then the third thing is just in terms of the kind of work that will be done at GCCs. And here is where I'm most excited. I think GCCs will continue to define the future of most businesses and will continue to be the hub where some of the most interesting work gets done. We're already seeing that if you look at some of the work that's being done out of companies like Facebook, Amazon, Google in India, or Uber for that matter, the quality, not just the quality, but the impact that the work built in these countries is having on the mothership is huge. And that just means that more and more companies will be confident to have extremely critical parts of their businesses get built out of GCC. From an India perspective, we're at about 1.3 million people working at GCCs. Estimates say that this number will increase to about 5 million by 2025, which is massive. India will continue to be a 30 to 50% driver of the GCC market globally. So we have a tremendous opportunity to be this hub. I also expect that there will be a lot of push towards bringing in more investment from the government and regulatory bodies, where they'll try and sort of create more economic zones, more incentives, and so on, which will only mean that more companies will set up in India. And so a lot of what we're talking about today, of course, hinges on the fact that we will continue to build top tier talent as we have, and for that we will continue to need more support infrastructure, so training schools and companies that come in and provide upskilling and reskilling and so on. And some of those companies will continue to flourish. So that's pretty much how I see things developing.
Got it, Vikram. I think all in all, it looks good. I think enough tailwinds and enough. I think history also shows that India has been an ideal place for these companies to build their teams. And I think, as I told you, right, the trilogy of talent, technology, and government kind of interventions, creating these SEZs and different regions as per sectors. Like it could be a pharma sector, a defense sector, it could be electronics. So I think the way government is also looking at it looks interesting. So also I've been reading quite a bit, and I'm also seeing that looks pretty positive. And I think this GCC model in my head looks pretty a win-win kind of a solution for everyone. And India being at the forefront of multiple technologies, I think definitely India has great potential to actually be the role model for GCC globally. Vikram, great having you. Thanks for taking out time. Though you're in Dubai, I mean, this is great. Absolute pleasure. Would definitely like to meet you once you're back in India.
No, I was just saying thanks, Vishal. It's been great. Thank you for having me.
Great, Vikram. Thanks a lot. Cheers.